When she walked out wearing that dark battle coat, the commentators literally stopped talking. It wasn't the usual pause for effect. It was a confused, heavy silence that hung over the arena like a thick fog. The crowd sensed it, something bad was coming. There was no music at first, just the hollow sound of boots hitting the steel ramp, a rhythmic thudding that echoed like a heartbeat in the throat of 20,000 people. And as those flames exploded behind her, turning her silhouette into a terrifying shadow of vengeance, everyone realized, she's back. But this wasn't the return they had advertised. This wasn't the smiling, waving hero coming home to shake hands and kiss babies. The atmosphere was wrong. It was heavy. Could see the confusion ripple through the front row. Fans who were cheering seconds ago slowly lowered their signs, their smiles fading into looks of genuine concern. The woman walking down that ramp wasn't playing a character. Her eyes were fixed on the ring, but they looked hollow, detached, as if she wasn't seeing the crowd at all, but staring directly at a ghost only she could see. The minimalist animation here should focus on the contrast, the small, isolated figure of the wrestler against the overwhelming, towering darkness of the arena. The commentator's silence spoke louder than any scream. Usually, Michael Cole or Corey Graves would be screaming about a monumental moment, but they were paralyzed. They were waiting for a cue in their headsets that never came. Script had been thrown out the window the moment her boot touched the stage. This was the first sign that the machine had lost control. The air in the stadium grew cold despite the pyro. It was the chill of reality breaking through the carefully curated fiction of television. She was here, and the panic was just beginning. While the arena fell into a stunned hush, the backstage area known as the gorilla position erupted into absolute chaos. If you could see behind the curtain at that exact moment, you wouldn't see a professional broadcast team. You would see panic. Producers were ripping off headsets, shouting over one another, frantically flipping through pages of a script that was now completely useless. The man in charge, usually the calmest voice in the storm, was slamming his hand on the desk, demanding to know who cleared her entrance music. No one had an answer. The monitors showed her walking closer to the ring, slow and methodical, like a predator stalking prey that didn't know it was being hunted. Backstage, the realization hit them like a physical blow. She wasn't supposed to be there until the main event, and certainly not like this. She was rogue. The timing was off. The lighting cues were wrong. This was a hijack on live global television. You could hear the frantic whispers of the production team leaking into the audio feed, a buzzing static of fear. "Cut to commercial! Cut the feed!" someone yelled, but the director hesitated. He hesitated because he couldn't look away. The tension was magnetic. To cut the feed now would be to admit they had lost control, to admit that the inmates were running the asylum. So they kept the cameras rolling, unintentional accomplices to whatever she was about to do. Da-da-da-da-da. The panic backstage wasn't just about a ruined segment. It was about the power dynamic shifting in real time. For years, the company held the leash, deciding who spoke and who stayed silent. But as she climbed the steel steps, ignoring the frantic cues from the referee to wrap it up, the executives in Gorilla realized the terrifying truth. They didn't own her anymore. She owned the moment. And she was about to burn their carefully planned narrative to the ground. The reaction wasn't limited to the production truck. Deep in the locker room, where the rest of the roster watched the show on small, grainy monitors, time seemed to stand still. Usually the locker room is a loud, bustling place, wrestlers taping up wrists, going over spots, laughing, or complaining about travel. But as her music hit and that dark coat swept across the screen, the room went dead silent. Wrestlers stopped mid-conversation. A champion, holding her title belt, stood frozen, clutching the gold a little tighter against her chest, her knuckles turning white. They knew. The fans might have thought this was a cool storyline, but the workers, the men and women who bleed for this business, knew the difference between a work and a shoot. They recognized the look in her eyes because they had all felt it at some point. The look of someone who has nothing left to lose. There was a mix of admiration and terror in that room. Admiration because she was doing what they were all too afraid to do, hijacking the show to speak her truth. Terror because they knew the fallout would hit them too. If she went off script and destroyed the hierarchy, the company would crack down. Rules would get tighter. Scripts would get stricter. The freedom they had fought for could vanish in an instant. The minimalist visual here is a room full of faceless figures, All heads turned toward a single glowing screen. The tension was palpable. Some of the younger talent looked to the veterans for reassurance, but the veterans just shook their heads. They knew that the landscape of the division was changing right before their eyes. She wasn't just walking to the ring to fight an opponent. She was walking out there to declare war on the status quo. And everyone in that locker room was now collateral damage. While the internal world of the WWE was crumbling into panic, the external world, the internet, was catching fire. Within seconds of her appearance, social media platforms began to buckle under the weight of the conversation. It wasn't just trending, it was dominating the global consciousness. Fans at home, watching on their laptops and phones, became instant detectives. They weren't listening to the commentary anymore. They were analyzing every frame. They zoomed in on the coat, noting it was the same one she wore the night she lost everything 2 years ago. They analyzed her body language, the lack of a smile, the way she didn't acknowledge the signs in the crowd. The speculation ran wild. Is this real? Did she just quit? Is she going to drop a pipe bomb? The line between fiction and reality is where wrestling makes its money. And she had just blurred that line so aggressively that no one knew where they stood. The panic from the company was visible to the savvy fans. They noticed the camera angles were shaky, not the usual polished cuts. They heard the hesitation in the announcers' voices. This authenticity is a drug to wrestling fans. They crave the moment the script breaks. The emotional connection here was profound. Fans who had felt marginalized, ignored, or frustrated with the product suddenly saw a vessel for their own anger. She represented the voice of the unheard. The fire behind her wasn't just pyrotechnics. It was a symbol of burning down the frustration of the past. As she stood in the center of the ring, waiting for a microphone, the digital world held its collective breath. The engagement numbers skyrocketed. People who hadn't watched wrestling in a decade were tuning in because their phones were blowing up. The panic the WWE felt was valid. They had lost control of the narrative, and the audience was eating it up. To understand the panic, we have to understand the ghost she carried with her into that ring. This wasn't just a return. It was a resurrection of a buried trauma. Years ago, she had left under a cloud of controversy. The narrative then was that she was difficult, that she took her ball and went home. The company had spent months burying her legacy, trying to erase her from the history books, editing her out of video packages, and instructing commentators not to speak her name. They wanted the world to forget she ever existed, but she didn't forget. During her time away, while the machine kept turning, she sat in silence. The visual here is stark, a stickman figure sitting alone in a vast empty room, while a chaotic, noisy world spins outside the window. She watched as others took her spot. She watched as the division she helped build was mismanaged. The emotional weight of that hiatus was heavy. It wasn't a vacation, it was exile. She had to rebuild her identity from scratch, stripping away the character the company gave her to find the person underneath. Walking back into that arena was an act of immense psychological courage. She was walking back into the belly of the beast that tried to digest her. The coat she wore was armor. It protected her from the memories of the shouting matches in the back, tearful phone calls to her family, the feeling of worthlessness that corporate machinery can inflict on an artist. When she stepped through the curtain, she carried all that pain with her. The panic in the producer's eyes was because they knew they hadn't fixed the problem. They had just put a bandage on a bullet wound, and now the wound was reopening on live TV. She was the ghost of their past mistakes, returning to haunt them. Why did WWE let her walk out if they were so panicked? Because they had no choice. This is the crucial, unseen layer of the story. In the weeks leading up to this moment, the negotiations had been a war. But this time, the dynamic had flipped. Before, she needed the platform. Now, the platform needed her. Ratings were slipping, merchandise sales were stagnant, and the soul of the show felt manufactured. They needed a spark, and she was the only fire hot enough to ignite it. But the deal was made with a devil's handshake. She agreed to return, but only on her terms. And her terms were dangerous. She refused to show them her promos. She refused to rehearse her entrance. She demanded total creative isolation until her music hit. The executives, desperate for the pop and the social media buzz, agreed, thinking they could manage her once she was in the building. They were wrong. As she stood in the ring, they realized they had handed a loaded gun to someone who had every reason to pull the trigger. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. He watched her on the monitors, checking their contracts, realizing there was nothing they could do to stop her without causing a riot. If they cut her mic, the crowd would revolt. If they sent security, it would look like a meltdown. She had leveraged their own desperation against them. She stood there, silent and imposing, knowing that for the next 10 minutes, she was the CEO of the company. It was a masterclass in power. She didn't need a title belt to hold power. She held the attention of millions, and in the modern era, attention is the only currency that matters. She finally lifted the microphone. The crowd, which had been buzzing with confused energy, instantly dropped to a hush so deep you could hear the air conditioning humming in the rafters. Everyone expected shouting. They expected a catchphrase. They expected the standard "daddy's home" or "I'm the boss" rhetoric. But she didn't shout. She whispered, "Do you know how long a year feels when you're screaming and no one hears you?" The line wasn't delivered with bravado. It was delivered with exhaustion. It was intimate, as if she were speaking to a friend in a coffee shop rather than an arena of strangers. This terrified the backstage officials even more. Shouting is part of the show. Shouting is wrestling. Whispering is real. Whispering draws people in. It breaks the fourth wall without even trying. She spoke about the loneliness of the road, the pressure of being a role model when you're falling apart inside, and the lie of the happy ending. The minimalist visual here is powerful. A tiny figure in a vast ring, the spotlight narrowing down until the rest of the world disappears. Just her and the truth. She wasn't playing a heel or a face. She was dismantling the binary entirely. She looked directly into the hard the camera that broadcasts to the world, and her eyes were wet. It's not fake tears, but the glassy sheen of genuine, raw emotion. She was exposing the industry's scars. She talked about the friends who were fired, the dreams that were crushed by bad creative writing, and the sheer mental toll of the spotlight. The panic backstage shifted from chaotic shouting to a stunned, somber silence. They weren't just losing control of a segment. They were being forced to look in the mirror. While the world focused on the ring, the emotional anchor of this story lay miles away in a quiet living room. Her family was watching. The camera of our story pans away from the bright lights to a dimly lit room where a mother, a father, perhaps a partner, sits on the edge of a sofa. They knew the truth behind the coat. They knew the night she came home unable to walk. They knew the depression that followed the release. They were the ones who picked up the pieces when the machine broke her. Seeing her back in that ring wasn't a moment of triumph for them. It was a moment of supreme anxiety. They knew that by walking out there, she was reopening the wound. They watched her hands tremble slightly, holding the mic, a detail the cameras missed, but they caught. They saw the defensive posture. They feared the backlash. They feared that the company would punish her for this honesty. This perspective adds a layer of humanity often missed in wrestling stories. We see these figures as superheroes, invincible, and larger than life. But to their families, they are fragile human beings putting their bodies and minds into a meat grinder for entertainment. Her return wasn't just a professional risk. It was a personal gamble. If this failed, if the crowd turned on her, or if the company buried her again, she might not recover this time. The family held hands, eyes glued to the screen, praying not for a victory but for her survival. Panic wasn't just corporate, it was domestic. It was the fear of seeing someone you love step back onto the ledge they just barely climbed down from. As her speech concluded, she didn't drop the mic. It's a cliché. Instead, she gently placed it on the canvas, as if laying a weapon down after a war. She looked around the arena, taking in the faces of the fans one last time. The panic backstage had subsided into a strange resignation. The segment had gone 5 minutes over time. Commercial breaks were missed. Sponsors were angry, but none of it mattered, as the story had been told. She turned to leave, but then stopped. The champion, the one who had been watching from the locker room in fear, walked out onto the stage. No music. No entrance video. Just two warriors staring at each other from across the distance. The crowd didn't cheer. They just vibrated with anticipation. This wasn't a match setup. It was a generational clash. It's the old guard, the rebel, the one who left, facing the new face of the corporation. The visual here is stark contrast. The champion in pristine, bright gear, holding the polished gold belt. The returnee in the dark, tattered battle coat, holding nothing but her trauma and her truth. No punches were thrown. They didn't need to be. The look they exchanged said everything. "I built this house," her eyes said. "I'm here to burn it down." The champion's eyes replied, "Try it." It was the most electric moment of the year, achieved without a single move. The WWE panicked because they realized the storyline they planned. The simple feud for a belt was dead. The fans wouldn't accept it anymore. They wanted this. They wanted the reality, the friction, the real heat. The screen faded to black, leaving millions sitting in silence. But here's the twist. The reflection that changes how we view the panic. We assumed the WWE panicked because she went off script. We assumed the fear was about losing control. But as the weeks went on, and the merchandise sales broke records, and the ratings hit a 10-year high, a darker truth emerged.
Ow.
The panic wasn't that she would destroy the company. The panic was that they realized she was right. Her return exposed the cracks in the foundation. It proved that the polished, overproduced, micromanaged style of modern wrestling was hollow. One woman, with a microphone and a coat, had outperformed millions of dollars of CGI in writing rooms. She forced the behemoth to evolve. The panic was the growing pains of an industry realizing it was obsolete.